rare earths have been outperforming precious metals, gold and silver, like for the last 10 years, pretty much consistently, because there's more demand for them. They have an intrinsic value, whereas, gold has more of an extrinsic value.
On this episode of Early Bird, Louis O'Connor, founder of Strategic Metals Invest. Louis joins the podcast today to talk about investing in rare earth metals, including a look at how the asset class is performing against other investments and why it's becoming more popular. If you're an investor looking to stay on top of the latest market trends, then you're listening to the right podcast. This is Early Bird, and I'm your host, Stephen Lerner. Before we get to today's discussion, let me tell you you can save time and beat the market through Early Bird, a free daily email newsletter featuring commentary about the latest trends in stocks, cryptocurrency, and equity crowdfunding. Early Bird is designed to help individual and non-professional investors stay on top of all of the critical investing trends. The newsletter is 100% free and is sent to your email box each weekday morning. Subscribe to Early Bird for free at www.earlybird.email. Once again, that's earlybird.email. And now, today's discussion. All right, Louis, welcome to the Early Bird podcast. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you, Stephen. Happy to be here.
Well, thank you too. We're going to talk about rare earth metals and why investors should look at this alternative investment class in 2023. But before we do that, Louis, in about 30 seconds or less, what should the audience know about you and your background?
Okay, well, I'm in Europe. I mean, you can probably tell from the accent. I'm coming to you from I'm in Ireland, but our business is Europe based. The metals facility and the vault and stuff is in Frankfurt in Germany. But yeah, I wouldn't say it's an alternative asset class. I'm not just into alternative assets. I'm into all sort of traditional as well. Oh. But I think always on the lookout for something new, and this is relatively new, at least to North America. To your audience, I think it'll be a very new, interesting asset class to hear about.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. How exactly would you define rare earth metals?
Okay, good question, because nowadays, for example, I'll tailor what I'm saying, Stephen, slightly to North America, because I know your audience is in North America. But for example, over in the US, you'll hear people talk about technology metals, right? Which are the metals that are in these very devices we're using, in all modern technology. You're also hearing a lot of people talk about energy transition metals, which are the metals that are needed in electric cars, the permanent magnets for electric cars, solar power, wind power. But they are all, in fact, rare earth metals. And the best way to describe it in a simple way is the name of my company is Strategic Metals Invest. And Strategic Metals is an umbrella term for all of those, for rare earth metals. Rare earth elements are like a powdered form. They also can come in liquid form. But essentially, they're critical to every nation's economic prosperity and also increasingly military capability. So we touch them, see them, feel them every day. Like, quick example, there's about 12 in your smartphone, and gold is in your smartphone, silver, but there's another 10 rare earths there that people can own as physical assets and profit from owning them.
And when you say profit from owning them, can I ask what you mean by that?
Well, much like, it's the same paradigm as buying gold or silver. People buy gold or silver to store it as a store of wealth, as a hedge against inflation. Rare earths, if anybody, does want more specific information, I'm happily supply it. But what I'm about to tell you, I can back up with, independent reports from Bloomberg and Kitco and places like that. But rare earths have been outperforming precious metals, gold and silver, like for the last, 10 years, pretty much consistently, because there's more demand for them. They have an intrinsic value, whereas, gold has more of an extrinsic value. Now, that's not to say there's a guarantee that you'll profit because it's a speculation. I mean, you're buying these raw materials that are needed in, technology, cars, medical devices, aviation, nuclear. There's not an industry they're really not in, but they're purely supply and demand driven. So you're sort of, that's what you're hedging on.
Makes sense. You talked about how the price of rare earth metals may have surpassed other metals over the past few years. This year in 2023, the stock market is starting to turn things around. It's starting to be positive for many investors, although last year, 2022, was a pretty bad year for traditional equities and for the stock market for many investors out there. How have rare earth metals performed during that time compared to stocks?
Okay, very well. In fact, like I'll give you first, let's say the decade so far. So from say sort of January, February 2020 to January, February 2003. If you had now, there's 10 rare earths we offer, Stephen. And we recommend our clients they diversify. They don't just buy one metal. Now they can if they want. It's up to them. But we recommend they buy a spread, if you will, of them all. But if you'd invested 3 years ago in all 10, which means you're basically invested in all of these industries we just spoke about, you'd be up on average 34, I'll give you the exact, it's 34.25% a year, every year. So you'd be up about, you'd already be up sort of about 120% in the first 3 years of the decade.
That's pretty good. But compared to stocks, I mean, for the decade, most stocks are up, depending on the class and whatever. But most equities are up during that time frame as well. So, why not just stay with traditional investments? Why look at rare earth metals?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that comment 100%. We have a saying here in Ireland about sort of horse racing. They say they might have it over there in America too.
Mm-hmm.
There's horses for courses. There's certain horses run well in certain conditions and horses, so I wouldn't say one is better than the other.
Mm-hmm.
I think rare earths add, for example, let me use real estate as an example. I think rare earths are a great partnership in a portfolio with, say, real estate, because real estate offers one thing rare earths doesn't, and rare earths offer one thing real estate doesn't. And one is high liquidity and the other is passive income, So they're just additional diversification. They're not for everybody. I mean, not everybody, is turned on by them, if that's the right expression. But, they're a valid, genuine, asset class that I think that you'll see them become more and more into the mainstream. Most people just aren't aware at this time that you can actually physically own them safely, securely, and liquidate them, when you've made some money. People just don't know about it. It's only been available as an asset class since about 2010 here in Europe. And at the moment, there's nobody, to my knowledge, in North America that offers what we offer, and that's why I'm speaking with you today. We have in the last 2 years gotten a lot of attention from the US. We've gotten quite a lot of clients, so we know it's an asset class people will like over there as well.
So I kind of want to get into that. I want to hear a little bit about what are the benefits, what are the advantages of rare earth metals, and also how exactly why exactly do you think you've seen increased popularity in investors who are interested in this asset class?
Okay, well, I think particularly in the US, rare earths have sort of moved up on the political agenda, right? There's two key things going on. The first one is worldwide now, not just in the US. We're going through this energy transformation. We're moving towards lower carbon economies, whether we agree with it or not, or, believe in climate change or not, is sort of irrelevant because it's happening where, every car manufacturer in the world is going electric. Ford in the US just announced in the last 6 months, the largest single in investment in their history, like $11.4 billion in what they call mega campuses for electric cars, which are basically factories for electric cars. So we're going there. And the raw materials that are needed for that transition are rare earth metals. Um, Probably the reason people wouldn't know about them so much is they haven't been needed as much as they are now. Just to give you a quick insight into why it's moving up the political agenda is in the US, the recently announced Inflation Reduction Act. There's some stipulations there about rare earths that the US and Europe. I know you're in the US, so I'm focusing a little bit on the US, but Europe is in the same boat. What most people in the US wouldn't know, Stephen, is that in the 1980s, the US was the dominant market leader in rare earths. The US was producing 60% of the world's rare earths in Mountain Pass in California, which still exists today. They still produce rare earths there. Oh. Now, something very interesting happened in the late 80s. You can Google this even. The premier of China at the time, Deng Xiaoping, made a very shrewd statement. He was standing on a mine for rare earths in China, and he said, the Middle East has oil and China has rare earths. Now, what happened then was technology exploded. And what really we know now is that China understood before Europe, before the US, that rare earths would become the backbone of manufacturing in the 21st century. So they decided to get a head start. And what's happened since then is China's now the completely dominant market leader in rare earths. 90% of the world's rare earths are processed in China. The Chinese legitimately sort of moved all the separation and the refining to China. So even that one facility in the US still now, they have to send their raw materials to China to be refined. So Europe and the US have just woken up that, these are now critical to, technology, aviation, nuclear reactors, electric cars, solar power. They're basically critical to economic prosperity. Yet Europe and the US is dependent on China. So I think that's why we're getting more interest from there as people are, realizing that, production needs to increase, demand is increasing, yet supply is limited and subject to disruption by China. That's why we've seen some of the prices go up as well.
Good point. When we return, we'll hear from Louis about disadvantages with this asset class and Louis' favorite rare earth metal in 2023. But first, let me tell you how you can become a more informed investor through Early Bird, a free daily email newsletter. Early Bird has commentary on the latest events and trends in stocks, cryptocurrency, and crowdfunding. With Early Bird's daily weekday email, investors can quickly stay on top of the trends and beat the market. Subscribe to Early Bird for free at www.earlybird.email. Once again, that's earlybird.email. And now, back to today's discussion. So, Louis, today we're talking about rare earth metals, why people should invest in them, and it makes sense given all the advantages. I want to talk about some of the drawbacks. What are some of the disadvantages of investing in rare earth metals?
Okay, well, look, they're completely driven, and supply and demand is in charge, Stephen. So, what that means is neither I know or anybody can predict what's happening in the future, right? So, with that in mind, the potential sort of there's pros and cons. Obviously, the cons could be, let's say, indium. Indium is you couldn't swipe your phone without indium. So you can imagine the amount of billions of smartphones are being made in the next 5 or 10 years. So possibly somebody could come up with a better technology than indium, and so demand for that particular metal could drop off. So other potential pitfalls, I suppose, could be China has 50% of the world's reserves. Most of the time, like for example, recently we saw some prices drop last month, and what happened was China had been stockpiling for themselves, and they stopped because they just couldn't keep up with their own sort of. They've sort of issues with electricity and water infrastructure in the area, where they're trying to sort of build more. And because they stopped stockpiling, there was a bit more available, so prices sort of dropped a little bit for a couple of weeks. So just normal stuff that's supply and demand. I mean, in terms of safety, security, I mean, if you buy metals from us, we're in business since 1999, and we're a bona fide industry supplier. That's probably the most important thing about us, Stephen, is, I'm not a sales and marketing guy in Ireland with this idea that I'll buy metals for you in China and we'll hopefully one day sell them to Apple or something. It's not that at all. We're a bona fide industry supplier, and our core business is buying from producers in China and then reselling to industry buyers. You could say, I'm going to borrow a term from America now, you could say the investment side is our side hustle. Now, it's that's too small a word for it. It's more than that. But the point I'm trying to make to you is, if it's only safe to do this business if you're buying from an industry supplier, because they're the only ones that can guarantee the authenticity of the materials. And secondly, they're the only one that can liquidate them for you as well, because the only end buyer for these metals are industry buyers as well. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. It does just also seem to me that one of the drawbacks of this asset class is liquidity as well as volatility. These seem like issues with this particular asset class. And I know you're talking about owning the actual, rare earth metal and making sure that you give it to investors. But there are other options out there. If you really want exposure to this particular asset class, you could, for example, invest in an exchange traded fund or ETF that specializes in rare earth metals. And there are several reputable ETFs online as well. So why not just go to an ETF instead of actually owning the commodity?
Sure. I mean, do that, absolutely. If that's, again, I don't say one is better or one should do this or do that. Everybody, has to sort of gather their own information and make a decision that works for them. I mean, you can also do both. I'd say, a good reason maybe to physically own them is, one, it can offer you some geographic diversification. You own a hard asset in a different jurisdiction. I mean, if all my assets, say, for example, are in one currency and in one country, even though I might be in 10 different asset classes, I don't have any sort of international diversification there. So that's always a help. Two, they're highly, highly liquid. They're extremely liquid if you're buying from an industry supplier like ourselves. I mean, we can, the purchase only takes 3 to 4 working days, and we can liquidate them as well in 3 to 4 working days. Now, what might happen, Stephen, that's happened before, there's a precedent here, right? China restricted rare earths at one point in 2010 for a few months, and we saw 5x and 10x increases. If China decides to weaponize rare earths again, we would, investors could be looking at, very, very, very good increases in price, Or another option is if China simply restricts the export quotas because they need them for themselves. I mean, China has big plans for electric cars, for solar, for wind. A lot of people might not know this, but less than half of China is on the grid. I mean, they're pulling hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, but they've a long, long way to go. So primarily, China's, reserves are for themselves. But if people do a little bit of research, they'll see what I'm saying is 100% true, which is the US and Europe at the moment stand in line to get what China will give them after they've satisfied their own domestic quotas. This is the real geopolitical strategy of China's, that, discerning investors, when they get armed with the right information, can see clearly, wow, I could actually sort of hack China's geopolitical strategy here by owning these hard assets.
Interesting. Louis, thank you so much for explaining some of those broader macro trends we're seeing in the industry. If you could, real quick, I know there are several rare earth metals out there that your company is focused on, but if you could say, here's one rare earth metal that's probably going to do the best or perform the best in price in 2023, what do you think that will end up being?
It's a good question, Stephen. And you can't hold me to this because, as you know, I cannot tell the future. And if I said I could, you should don't air this podcast. But I'm still adding to my portfolio, and I don't have a favorite, but I do have some favorites, and those are the energy transition metals, which are neodymium, dysprosium, praseodymium, and terbium. So those four are critical to electric mobility. So electric cars, wind, and solar. And just to give you an idea, I can only give you the numbers for Europe, and it's probably not much different than in the US, but it's already estimated that between now and 2030, in Europe, we're going to consume between 7 and 26 times more of these raw materials than we currently are. So the increase in demand and usage is just phenomenal. And actually, the truth of it is, Stephen, there's not enough of these rare earths available. And this might sound like an exaggeration, but I don't think it is. I've heard this from some of the experts, is that some of the car manufacturers, that we know and love, in Europe and the US, probably might not be around in about 10 years. Simply one or two might not make it because they won't be able to source these raw materials. Oh, wow. Tesla, Ford, Volkswagen, they all need them, but there's just not enough. Wow. So anyway, to give you, I wouldn't say one, but I would say the 3 or 4 energy transition metals.
It makes sense given the state of things right now. That those would be favorable for this particular time period. Louis, thank you so much for coming on the Early Bird podcast and discussing rare earth metal investing. Before we wrap up the show, I just have one final question, and it's the most important question for today's discussion. That question for you, Louis, is if you could be guaranteed one thing in life, what would it be? And you can't say money.
Peace of mind.
Peace of mind. Why is that?
Well, I think when you have peace of mind, if you're at peace with yourself, you're at peace with all around you. All your family, friends, neighbors, the world and universe in general. I think that's what, ultimately, I think that I suppose I don't know if I can say any more than that, but look, I don't know. Do I have peace of mind? Yeah, most of the time. But would I like it permanently? Yes.
Thank you again to Louis O'Connor for sharing your insights on rare earth metals. And thank you to everyone for listening to today's discussion. We'll be back next week for another episode of Early Bird. Have a great day.